All of a sudden, I heard a big explosion.
A mysterious flaw brings down a Boeing 737.
There's something going on that left no marks, no calling card.
Shortly after takeoff, a powerful explosion rips apart TWA Flight 800, igniting controversy about what really happened.
If anybody thinks that this chairman is involved in any kind of cover-up, they're damn wrong.
Conflicting commands put two jets on a collision course.
Descend, descend.
And the devastation provokes a violent act.
It was a crime of almost unimaginable magnitude.
Terrifying crashes and the dramatic investigations.
The Navy's a suspect.
True-to-life animations reveal the critical moments that lead to disaster. September 8, 1994, traveling from Chicago, U.S. Air Flight 427 is flying at 6,000 feet as it prepares to land in Pittsburgh. When suddenly, the Boeing 737 spirals out of control. 28 seconds later, it smashes down into a field in Hopewell Township, Pennsylvania.
There was a real loud motor that was screaming. All of a sudden, I heard a big explosion.
Police officer George David is 2.5 miles away from the crash site, which happens to be next to his farm.
That was when I got the phone call. They said, you better get up here right now. A plane had just crashed on the property.
When David arrives, it is a horrifying scene. The airplane has been obliterated by the 300-mile-per-hour impact. There is no hope for the 132 passengers and crew on board.
I've been a policeman for 25 years. I've seen a lot of things, but that was the worst that I've ever seen it.
Investigators will try to find clues among the destruction. It's a daunting task for the NTSB investigator in charge, Tom Howiter.
It was the first time that the U.S. NTSB team had to wear biohazard suits to go on site. Because of the impact and the level of destruction, there were just human remains everywhere.
You can see what the fuel did into the trees.
An aviation maintenance technician captures the scene up close, providing a rare and vivid glimpse into the investigation.
Bodies up there.
There was no airplane left.
It's like the cockpit up there.
Clearly, the airplane hit close to being vertical at a high rate of speed.
See, looking at one of the engines, right engine. It's like the right wing. You can see it's not very far from the tail section.
Pilot John Cox, who has extensive background with 737s, is assigned to the investigation as a representative for the Airline Pilots Association.
Facing now the direction that the airplane was, it's directly behind.
As an aircraft accident investigator, you have to shift into this, I can't help the people that are here. I now need to understand what happened so that we don't have a reoccurrence.
Several teams work to identify and recover pieces of the wreckage.
Left engine pickup. Seat parts and clothing, some wires. And the stuff here is waiting for decontamination before it goes to the hangar.
At a nearby hangar, the wreckage will be sorted and analyzed piece by piece.
This is day one of the sorting process.
The flight data and cockpit voice recorders were ejected from the airplane on impact and are quickly recovered. But they don't provide any clear answers. There are no sounds of explosions and no evidence of a major mechanical failure. But the recorders do provide investigators with a clearer picture of the flight crew's final moments. 1 minute before impact, the crew of Flight 427 is alerted to another airplane that will be passing below them.
They're looking for the airplane. The first officer acquires it visually and tells the captain, yes, I see the jet stream. And then they encounter the wake turbulence of a Delta Airlines 727. And not an uncommon event at all. The airplane rocks around and moves. And from that moment of encountering the wake, something happened. They couldn't stop the roll in the airplane. And this was very difficult to listen to as a pilot because I could hear them struggling for control of the airplane, and every second that ticked by, they were losing that battle.
As seen in this NTSB video, investigators set up a test flight to examine the possibility that the U.S. air pilots were startled by the wake of the nearby 727 airplane, causing them to lose control.
What we found was that you could take the airplane, let go of the controls, and the airplane would come out of the wake and regain its composure and fly on with no problems. There was no reason to lose control of the airplane.
One of the lead investigators made a very, very good observation, and that was that if the wake of a 727 could cause the loss of control of a 737, we'd have 737s falling out of the sky weekly or more.
Investigators zero in on Flight 427's rotation or yawing toward the left, just moments before the pilots lost control.
We knew the airplane yawed. And the question was, what would cause that? And it quickly became apparent that the only device that could make the airplane yaw the way it did is the rudder. That's what it's designed for.
The rudder is positioned at the tail of the Boeing 737 and is used by pilots to control the plane's movement to the left and right. Trying to determine how the rudder could have malfunctioned, investigators test every theory they have.
There were a couple of people on the airplane that were very heavy, and someone said, well, what would happen if the floor gave way and a passenger stepped on a control cable? Could that have done it?
And so we did a test, and that quickly became obvious that that event couldn't happen. The amount of weight required was too great. So we looked at all kinds of bizarre potential failures. You name it, everything was considered, and one by one we eliminated them.
We felt confident that there was a rudder issue, but we didn't know what it was. There's something going on back in the tail of the airplane we don't understand. I had described it as a gremlin that left no marks, that left no calling card.
But it's not the only unsolved accident weighing on investigators. 3 years earlier, an amateur photographer captures the burning wreckage of United Flight 585 in Colorado Springs. The crash kills all 25 people on board.
The safety board could not determine exactly what caused the accident. People started linking US Air 427 to United 585. Both airplanes are on approach. Both airplanes suddenly rolled and dove into the ground for unknown reasons.
And the two flights have something else in common. Both airplanes are Boeing 737s.
The most widely used jet in the world. The second time something unexpected had happened and resulted in the loss of an airplane. If another one went down, they were going to ground the airplane. And the ramifications for grounding the 737 were unbelievably severe. This sets off a global economic catastrophe. We had to find out what happened.
Coming up, another Boeing 737 ends up in serious trouble. Could that crisis lead to a break in the case? U.S. Air Flight 427 smashes down outside of Pittsburgh. It is the second Boeing 737 in 3 years to suddenly roll for unknown reasons and then crash, killing everyone on board. It's a mystery threatening to ground the most widely used jet in the world. Investigators suspect a problem with the rudder, which controls the plane's movement to the left and right, but they find no evidence of a malfunction. Nearly 2 years after the crash, a possible break in the case. The pilot of an Eastwind Airlines Boeing 737 experiences a sudden roll as the jet approaches Richmond, Virginia.
He quickly got on the rudder pedals, and so you have two pilots shoving with all their might on a rudder pedal, and all it's doing is driving them back. It keeps pushing back at them. It doesn't go forward. We've never had this report from a crew before of a pedal back forcing against them. Now we're into a different scenario.
Fortunately, they were at a higher airspeed than 427, which gave them more roll control. They were able to successfully land the airplane.
After hearing the pilot's experience with the rudder pedals, investigators suspect a jam may be the problem in the airplane's rudder system.
The pilots control the rudder on the 737 with pedals. Those pedals are connected via cables to the muscle, if you will, that physically moves the rudder. It's the power control unit. And like power steering in your car, it's hydraulically powered.
About the size of a soda can, the Power Control Unit, or PCU, houses a set of valves called the dual servo valve. This directs hydraulic fluid to move the rudder.
This is the dual servo valve from a power control unit. The pilot inputs go into the arms here, and just by moving back and forth across these openings, it would redirect the fluid.
In the days after the U.S. Air accident, investigators recovered Flight 427's PCU from the crash site.
Seems intact, some of the brackets broken.
If something did malfunction inside this PCU, it left no evidence.
The valves were not badly scarred. There were no marks. There wasn't an instant indication of what would have caused the power control unit to have problems.
Investigators run a battery of tests on the PCUs from U.S. Air 427 and East Wind Airlines, trying to determine if the units can jam. What they find is even more alarming. Not only can the PCU jam, but it can then deflect the rudder in the opposite direction.
If you jammed the secondary valve just slightly off neutral, you could cause the valves to basically misalign and port hydraulic fluid in the wrong direction, so the rudder reversed operation. And this would be like driving your car and you turn to the left and the car goes right. You're never going to figure this out before you go off the road.
Investigators had found a lethal malfunction in a valve the size of a pencil, capable of bringing down a Boeing 737. The malfunction leaves no marks or scars, almost as if it never happened, matching exactly what investigators found in U.S. Air 427.
And all of a sudden, you put the reversal scenario in, and all started coming together that all these parts now fit. The big puzzle, we've had the edges and everything else, now the centerpieces are all locking in.
When Flight 427's crew encounters the wake turbulence of a passing airplane, they press down on the rudder pedals to counter the wake and move the airplane slightly to the right. But the dual servo valve inside the airplane's power control unit jams and misaligns, causing the rudder to be deflected in the opposite direction.
And what they didn't recognize was that the rudder was full over. So as they're pushing, the rudder's not moving because it's jammed, but they don't know this.
And then the nose starts to fall through, and the crew pulls back to bring the nose up, and the airplane just enters basically what looks like a spin into the ground.
The pilots of 427 faced a condition they had never heard of, they weren't trained for. From a pilot standpoint, you never consider the possibility that if you turn to the right, the airplane's going to go to the left. They didn't have a long time to sort it out, and they had around 13 seconds to diagnose the problem, deal with it effectively.
It takes 4.5 years, one of the longest accident investigations in aviation history, to solve the mystery of U.S. Air Flight 427. With it, investigators are able to bring closure to another cold case, United Flight 585, the other Boeing 737 that crashed 3 years earlier.
The rudder system on the 737 fleet has been completely redesigned. It's a very different system now than it was at that time. There's a lot of changes also to flight crew training, more hands-on flying, being ready to recover from unusual upsets, unusual events.
History's proven us to be right. There has not been another occurrence of a rudder hardover since, and I think we made a good airplane even better.
Coming up, one of the most infamous aviation disasters in history.
We saw what appeared to be a flare going straight up.
What really happened to TWA Flight 800?
Microscopic explosive traces of unknown origin have been found.
July 17th, 1996. Beachgoers and boaters are enjoying a summer evening at twilight on Long Island, New York. Nearby, at JFK Airport, a Boeing 747 is taking off, carrying 230 passengers and crew headed for Paris. Less than a minute later, as TWA Flight 800 is climbing over the Atlantic, there's an explosion. The force rips the airplane apart. Other pilots in the area begin reporting what they've seen to air traffic control.
We just saw an explosion up ahead of us here. Someone about 16,000 feet or something like that. It just went down to the water.
Rescue teams scour the area for survivors, but no one is found alive. As dusk turns to dark, all that can be seen of the Boeing 747 is the burning debris and jet fuel on the surface of the water.
We've seen the big flames. We didn't expect to see that. Right when we seen that, we knew it was going to be pretty bad. We found our first victim. And there was a female in bad shape.
As the wreckage burns, so does speculation that there may have been a bomb on board the plane.
You have to remember the time. This had been the first attempt at the World Trade Center. And I think terrorism was just getting on people's radars.
By morning, eyewitness accounts point to yet another alarming possibility: a missile.
We saw what appeared to be a flare going straight up.
And then we seen this white glowing thing, and then a big ball of fire come out of it, and 2 pieces on fire fell into the water.
The NTSB sends a GO team to determine what brought down the plane, while the FBI launches a criminal investigation.
If it is a terrorist event, we then have the challenge to find out who the perpetrators were, who the cowards were that did this.
From the safety board point of view, we want to know, is it possibly just an aviation safety issue we need to know about? And so there became 2 investigations, one for the FBI and one for the NTSB.
The first challenge for investigators, recovering the victims and the wreckage submerged more than 150 feet in the Atlantic Ocean. To do this, investigators employ the resources of the U.S. Navy. It will be one of the largest diver-assisted salvage operations ever conducted. It is both difficult and dangerous.
I talked to the grapple master diver, and he was talking about that it was like diving in razor blades.
As pieces of the wreckage are recovered and examined, investigators find what could be a frightening break in the case.
Microscopic explosive traces of unknown origin have been found.
Even more disturbing, rumors are swirling online that a missile may not have been fired by terrorists, but by the U.S. military. The FBI investigates the claims, scrutinizing U.S. naval vessels in the area at the time of the crash, but they find no evidence.
But I can assure you that we've looked at every angle, every possibility, and the military of this country has had nothing to do with this horrendous tragedy.
But proponents of the friendly fire theory believe there's been a cover-up.
The Navy is a suspect.
Let's get it, come on.
The Navy is a suspect. Why shouldn't they be involved in the investigation?
If anybody thinks that this chairman, this agency is involved in any kind of cover-up, then they're damn wrong. I tried to deal with the distraction so our investigators could deal with doing their work.
Investigators have been recovering as much of TWA Flight 800 as they can, pulling pieces from the bottom of the ocean and transferring them to a hangar where they will attempt to reconstruct the aircraft.
To see that mass of jumble and wires certainly brought home to me how difficult it's going to be to try to put that all back together again.
Investigators recover hundreds of pieces of the wreckage, an astounding 95% of the airplane. When they finish assembling this massive puzzle, it is the largest aircraft reconstruction in history.
When an explosive device goes off in close proximity to metal, it leaves behind very small craters and localized melting and all kinds of soot patterns and things like that. We were able to determine that there was absolutely no evidence that a bomb exploded close to the structure, and also that there was no evidence that any kind of particle might have penetrated from a missile that exploded nearby.
Looking inside the airplane, we had all of the human remains x-rayed, looking for fast particles of an explosion that have been captured by the body. All the seat cushions, all the other parts we had examined, looking for the evidence of an explosion with a shrapnel flying about. We didn't see that in any evidence we saw coming back.
As for the traces of explosive residue found, investigators believe it could have been transferred from military ships that transported the wreckage from the crash site. After 16 months, the FBI closes their parallel investigation.
The team conducted a total and thorough investigation. 1, there was no evidence of high explosive damage. 2, there was no evidence of explosion of a missile warhead. 3, there was no evidence of missile impact.
If it isn't a criminal act, then what brought down TWA Flight 800? And how can the eyewitness accounts be explained? Coming up.
We were all surprised that it didn't take a lot of energy to ignite these vapors.
July 17, 1996, TWA Flight 800 explodes in flames shortly after takeoff. The FBI rules out a bomb or missile, but it will take a 4-year investigation, the most costly and extensive in the NTSB's history, to determine the cause. After pulling debris from the ocean, investigators conclude that the airplane broke apart into 3 distinct sections.
The front section of the airplane containing the cockpit and the first class areas broke off, and that just fell to the ground. And then, much further away, you had the rest of the airplane, which seems odd. It was clear that piece of the airplane had to continue some part of flight for a lot longer. We went back and started looking at all those pieces that came off first. They all came out of areas around the wing center fuel tank. So it started becoming apparent that whatever happened inside the wing center fuel tank.
Unlike gasoline, jet fuel isn't highly flammable. But as this FAA test shows, when it's heated, the vapors that are produced can be explosive. As TWA Flight 800 prepares to take off from New York's JFK Airport, the center wing fuel tank, about the size of a 2-car garage, is nearly empty.
All that was in that fuel tank was basically just residual fuel, just a small amount of fuel sloshing around the bottom of the tank.
Given the short duration of this particular flight, the operators don't usually use or put fuel into the center fuel tank because they don't need it. The wings hold a sufficient amount of fuel.
You could save some money and get better performance by leaving the fuel out of it.
With passengers waiting on board Flight 800, a delay with baggage is keeping the plane at the gate.
It was a hot day in New York, and they had the air conditioning packs running to keep the aircraft cool. The air conditioning packs are mounted in close proximity to the center fuel tank.
As the AC packs work to keep the airplane cool, they are actually generating heat underneath the center wing fuel tank.
So the fuel tank was actually getting very warm. So when the airplane takes off, you have this warm fuel vapor. If there was a full load of fuel in that tank, it could absorb that heat with no problem.
It was generally believed that fuel tanks were not really flammable. They couldn't really even be ignited because the temperature wasn't great enough.
And so we took a 747, tested them with very similar conditions, and we were all surprised.